The boardroom erupted into nervous laughter when they told me I was, quote, hopelessly out of touch with modern business practices. 3 hours later, that same old-fashioned approach would be the only thing standing between them and losing the biggest deal in company history. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning started like any other Tuesday at Meridian Capital, except for the unusual tension crackling through the air like electricity before a storm. I'd been with the firm for 12 years, watching it grow from a scrappy investment boutique into a powerhouse managing over $8 billion in assets. My corner office on the 32nd floor had earned its view through countless late nights, weekend calls with nervous clients, and handwritten thank you notes that my colleagues mocked as antiquated. Margaret Henley was pacing behind the glass conference table when I walked in, her stilettos clicking against the marble floor in a rhythm that spoke of barely contained frustration. The morning sun streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows caught the sharp angles of her face, casting shadows that made her look more predatory than usual. She'd been brought in 6 months ago as our new Director of Client Relations, armed with an MBA from Wharton, and a vocabulary stuffed with buzzwords like synergistic optimization and disruptive methodologies. Rebecca, she said without looking up from her tablet, we need to discuss your approach to client management. I settled into my usual seat, the one I'd occupied for every major strategy meeting since joining the firm. Around the table sat the other senior partners, David Chen, who'd started the same week as me but somehow always managed to position himself as the voice of innovation, Sarah Williams, whose aggressive acquisition strategies had earned her a reputation as a shark in Armani, and James Morrison, the firm's compliance officer who treated every regulation like a personal commandment. Margaret finally looked up, her perfectly manicured fingers drumming against the table's surface. Your methods are becoming a liability, Rebecca. While the rest of us are embracing digital transformation and automated client outreach, you're still sending handwritten letters and making house calls like it's 1985. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. I'd heard variations of this criticism before, usually delivered with condescending smiles and suggestions that I modernize my approach. What they didn't understand, what they couldn't see beyond their algorithms and automated email campaigns, was that relationships weren't built through efficiency metrics and conversion rates. My clients appreciate the personal touch, I replied calmly, keeping my voice steady despite the knot forming in my stomach. The Henderson portfolio alone has grown by 38% under my management. That's exactly the problem, Margaret shot back, her voice gaining momentum. You're so focused on individual relationships that you're missing the bigger picture. We need scalable solutions, not boutique hand-holding. David leaned forward, his expression a careful mixture of concern and opportunity. He'd been waiting for a moment like this, a chance to position himself as the forward-thinking alternative to my supposedly outdated methods. Margaret's right, Rebecca. The Pemberton Group has been asking pointed questions about our client management protocols. They want to see innovation, automation, predictive analytics. Your approach, while admirable, doesn't align with their expectations for a modern investment firm. The Pemberton Group. The name carried weight in our industry like a thunderclap. They were old money, the kind of institutional client that could make or break a firm our size. For the past 8 months, we'd been courting them for what everyone called the deal of the decade. A $200 million portfolio transfer that would cement Meridian's position among the top-tier investment houses. Sarah Williams spoke up, her voice carrying the kind of calculated precision that had made her legendary in hostile takeover negotiations. The preliminary meetings have gone well, but they've specifically requested a presentation of our client management infrastructure. They want to see how we handle high-net-worth relationships at scale. I felt the walls closing in, but I kept my expression neutral. These people had been my colleagues for years, and some of them had been my friends. Now they were circling like vultures, and I was the wounded animal they'd identified as expendable. My track record speaks for itself, I said, pulling out a folder I'd prepared weeks ago when I first sensed the shift in office dynamics. 97% client retention rate over the past 5 years. Average portfolio growth of 22% annually. 0 compliance violations. My clients don't just trust me with their money, they refer their friends and family. Margaret waved dismissively, as if my statistics were irrelevant trivia. Numbers that small are easy to maintain, Rebecca, but we're talking about institutional level management. The Pemberton Group manages pension funds, endowments, sovereign wealth funds. They need to see sophisticated systems, not grandmother's recipe book. The insult was subtle but unmistakable. In Margaret's world, anything that couldn't be automated, scaled, or optimized was inherently inferior. She'd never sat in a client's living room at midnight, talking them through a market crash. She'd never written a condolence card to a widow whose husband had entrusted his life savings to our firm. She'd never held the hand of a terrified retiree watching their nest egg fluctuate with international tensions. James Morrison cleared his throat, the sound cutting through the tension like a referee's whistle. The compliance department has been reviewing all client interaction protocols in preparation for the Pemberton audit. Rebecca, your files show an unusually high number of unlogged client contacts. Phone calls, emails, and meetings that weren't entered into the CRM system. My blood ran cold. In a regulated industry like ours, documentation wasn't just best practice, it was legal requirement. Every client interaction had to be logged, categorized, and stored for regulatory review. But my approach had always been more fluid, more human. When Mrs. Patterson called crying about her late husband's pension, I didn't immediately think to log the conversation under grief counseling or, quote, portfolio anxiety management. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Those were pastoral care calls, I explained, knowing how weak it sounded even as I said it. Clients going through difficult times, needing reassurance more than investment advice. Pastoral care? Margaret's eyebrows arched with theatrical disbelief. Rebecca, we're investment advisors, not therapists. Every client interaction represents potential liability exposure. What if one of these undocumented conversations led to an investment decision that went wrong? What if a client claimed you gave unauthorized advice? Quote. The room fell silent except for the distant hum of air conditioning and the muffled sounds of morning traffic 32 floors below. I could see the trap closing, the careful construction of a narrative that painted my personal approach as reckless, outdated, and legally dangerous. David shuffled through some papers, producing what looked like a formal report. The executive committee met yesterday evening to discuss restructuring our client relations department. Given the importance of the Pemberton presentation and our need to demonstrate cutting-edge methodologies, we've decided to implement a new automated client management system. He slid the document across the table toward me. The letterhead read, Meridian Capital Partners, in embossed gold letters, and the subject line made my stomach drop. Termination of employment, Rebecca Mitchell. This is effective immediately, Margaret continued, her voice taking on the practiced neutrality of someone who'd rehearsed this moment. We've prepared a generous severance package, and will be happy to provide positive references for your future endeavors. Your clients will be transitioned to our new automated system over the next 30 days. I stared at the document without touching it, the words blurring slightly as the reality of the situation settled over me like a heavy blanket. 12 years of my life, hundreds of relationships built through trust and personal attention, reduced to efficiency problem that required elimination. You're making a mistake, I said quietly, my voice steadier than I felt. Those relationships aren't transferable to an automated system. When Mr. Henderson's grandson was diagnosed with leukemia, he didn't call the main number and navigate through phone trees. He called me directly because he knew I would understand what that meant for his estate planning. Sarah leaned back in her chair, her expression shifting from professional courtesy to barely concealed impatience. Rebecca, those kinds of personal entanglements are exactly what we're trying to avoid. Emotional decision-making leads to suboptimal portfolio performance. Our new system will provide clients with data-driven recommendations based on algorithmic analysis of market conditions and risk tolerance assessments. And when the algorithms fail, I asked, finally reaching for the termination letter but not opening it. When the market does something unexpected and clients panic, who's going to talk them through the fear and keep them from making devastating mistakes? Margaret's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. That's what stop-loss orders and automated rebalancing protocols are for, Rebecca. We don't need human intervention for basic risk management." The arrogance in her voice was breathtaking. These people had convinced themselves that decades of human psychology and market behavior could be reduced to code and conditional statements. They'd forgotten that behind every portfolio was a real person, with real fears, real hopes, and real lives that couldn't be optimized with spreadsheet formulas. James Morrison spoke up again, his tone carrying the weight of legal authority. "The transition plan calls for all client files to be uploaded to the new CRM system by Friday. Your access credentials will be deactivated at the end of today to ensure a clean handover." I stood up slowly, the termination letter still unopened in my hand. Around the table, my former colleagues avoided eye contact, some studying their phones, others suddenly fascinated by the view outside the windows. Only Margaret met my gaze, and in her eyes I saw something that looked almost like satisfaction. "I hope you know what you're doing," I said, tucking the letter into my briefcase. The Pemberton Group didn't get to where they are by trusting algorithms with their most important decisions. They got there by working with people who understand that money isn't just numbers on a screen. Margaret's laugh was cold and dismissive. "Rebecca, the Pemberton Group specifically requested our most innovative approaches. They want to see the future of wealth management, not the past." I walked toward the door, each step feeling like I was leaving behind more than just a job. These hallways had been my second home, these people my extended family. Now they were strangers, executing a business decision with the same emotional investment they'd show in updating office supplies. At the door, I paused and turned back. "When this new system of yours crashes and burns, when clients start fleeing because they feel like account numbers instead of human beings, remember this conversation." Margaret's expression didn't change, but I caught the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. "That's not going to happen, Rebecca. The future is automated, efficient, and scalable. Your methods belong in a museum." Quote, I left the conference room and walked slowly back to my office, past the cubicles where junior analysts pretended not to notice the tension radiating from the executive floor. My assistant, Linda, looked up from her computer with concern etched across her face. "Ms. Mitchell, is everything okay?" I managed a smile, though it felt like plastic stretched across my face. "I'm cleaning out my office today, Linda. It's been wonderful working with you." Her face fell and I saw the question forming on her lips, but I couldn't bear to explain. Not yet. Not until I'd processed what had just happened and figured out what came next. My office felt different now, like I was seeing it through the eyes of a visitor rather than its occupant. The family photos on my desk, the thank you cards from grateful clients pinned to my bulletin board, the leather-bound notebook where I kept handwritten records of every important conversation. All of it suddenly felt like artifacts from a previous life. I started packing methodically, wrapping picture frames in tissue paper and emptying desk drawers into cardboard boxes. Each item told a story. The crystal paperweight from the Johnson family after I'd helped them navigate their son's college funding crisis. The fountain pens set from Mr. and Mrs. Rodriguez when their retirement portfolio hit their target goal. The hand-carved wooden nameplate that my first client had commissioned as a Christmas gift. The phone rang, jolting me from my melancholy inventory. The caller ID showed a number I recognized immediately. Harrison Pemberton, 3, patriarch of the Pemberton Group, and the man whose approval could make or break our firm's future. "Rebecca, my dear," his voice carried the patrician accent of old New England money, refined through generations of prep schools and Ivy League universities. "I trust I'm not catching you at an inopportune moment." I sank into my chair, wondering if he somehow knew about the morning's events. "Not at all, Mr. Pemberton. How can I help you?" "I'm calling with rather urgent news, I'm afraid. There's been a development in our family's investment strategy that requires immediate attention. My grandson, Harrison 1/5, has been diagnosed with a rare genetic condition that will require extensive treatment over the coming years. We need to restructure our entire portfolio to accommodate these new circumstances." Quote, my mind immediately shifted into problem-solving mode. The same analytical process I'd refined over 12 years of helping clients navigate complex financial challenges. "I'm so sorry to hear about your grandson, Mr. Pemberton. What kind of timeline are we looking at for treatment? And do you have estimates for the associated costs? The doctors are saying anywhere from 5 to 10 years of specialized care, potentially $20 to $30 million in total expenses. We need liquidity, but we also can't afford to sacrifice long-term growth. It's precisely the kind of delicate balance that requires a human touch rather than algorithmic recommendations. The irony was almost too perfect to believe. Here was the most important client in the firm's history, specifically requesting the kind of personalized service that had just gotten me fired. He was asking for exactly what Margaret and her team had dismissed as outdated and inefficient. When would you like to meet to discuss restructuring options? I asked, my mind already running through potential strategies. That's the urgent part, my dear. The family board is meeting tomorrow morning to make final decisions about our investment partnerships. We'd planned to wait until next week's formal presentation, but circumstances have forced our hand. We need to know today whether Meridian Capital can provide the kind of sophisticated, personalized service that a situation like this demands. I felt like I was standing at the edge of a cliff, looking down at jagged rocks and churning water. In less than 4 hours, I'd been terminated for being too personal, too hands-on, too focused on individual relationships. Now the client everyone was desperate to impress was specifically asking for exactly those qualities. Mr. Pemberton, I need to be completely transparent with you about something that's developed here at Meridian today. Rebecca, let me stop you there. His voice carried a note of gentle authority. I've been in this business for 47 years. I've seen firms rise and fall based on their ability to adapt to human needs rather than technological trends. Whatever internal politics are happening at your firm, my primary concern is whether you personally can help my family navigate this crisis. The weight of his words settled over me like a warm blanket. He wasn't just asking about Meridian's capabilities, he was asking about mine. After a morning of being told my methods were obsolete, here was validation from one of the most sophisticated investors in the country. Yes, I said without hesitation. I can help you. Excellent. I'll be flying in from Boston this afternoon. Can you meet me at the Union Club at 4 o'clock? We'll need privacy for this conversation, and I prefer discussing family matters away from corporate offices. I agreed to the meeting, hung up the phone, and sat in the sudden silence of my office. Outside my window, the city continued its daily rhythm, oblivious to the drama playing out 32 floors above the street. Somewhere in this building, Margaret was probably already planning the automated system that would handle the Pemberton account. She had no idea that her most important client was specifically rejecting everything her new approach represented. The next few hours would determine not just my future, but the future of Meridian Capital itself. And despite being fired for my old-fashioned methods, I was about to prove that some things, trust, personal attention, human understanding, could never be automated away. The Union Club hadn't changed much since its founding in 1836, and that was exactly the point. Dark mahogany panels lined the walls. Leather-bound books filled floor-to-ceiling shelves, and the air carried the faint aroma of aged whiskey and old money. It was the kind of place where handshake deals worth hundreds of millions were still considered binding contracts, where reputation mattered more than quarterly earnings reports. Harrison Pemberton III was waiting for me in a private dining room on the 3rd floor, his silver hair perfectly styled and his navy suit pressed to military precision. At 78, he carried himself with the quiet confidence that came from generations of successful stewardship over vast family wealth. His handshake was firm, his blue eyes sharp with intelligence that had weathered decades of market volatility and economic upheaval. Rebecca, thank you for meeting me on such short notice, he said, gesturing to a leather chair across from his own. I've ordered tea, but please feel free to request anything else. I settled into the chair, my mind still reeling from the morning's events. Here I was, freshly terminated for being out of touch with modern practices, sitting across from a man whose family controlled more wealth than some small countries. The contradiction would have been amusing if the stakes weren't so high. Mr. Pemberton, before we discuss your grandson's situation, I feel obligated to inform you that as of this morning I'm no longer employed by Meridian Capital. His eyebrows rose slightly, but his expression remained neutral. I see. May I ask what precipitated this development? I took a deep breath, choosing my words carefully. The firm has decided to implement an automated client management system. My approach was deemed too personal, too hands-on for their vision of modern wealth management. A slow smile spread across his weathered face, and he leaned back in his chair with what looked like genuine amusement. They fired you for caring too much about your clients? Essentially, yes. They want scalable solutions, algorithmic recommendations, and standardized protocols. My method of building personal relationships was considered inefficient and potentially risky from a compliance standpoint. Mr. Pemberton was quiet for a long moment, his fingers steepled as he processed this information. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. Rebecca, in my 47 years of managing family wealth, I've seen every trend, every innovation, every supposed revolution in investment strategy. I've watched brilliant firms destroy themselves chasing the latest technological solutions while forgetting the fundamental truth of this business. We're not managing money, we're managing human lives. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder, placing it carefully on the table between us. This contains the complete financial profile of the Pemberton family holdings. $237 million in diversified assets, accumulated over 4 generations through careful stewardship and personal relationships with trusted advisors. I stared at the folder, understanding the magnitude of what he was showing me. This wasn't just a client file. It was the blueprint of a financial dynasty, the kind of generational wealth that required not just expertise, but genuine care to preserve and grow. When my grandson was diagnosed last week, he continued, my first thought wasn't about algorithms or automated rebalancing. It was about finding someone who would understand that behind these numbers are real people facing a real crisis. Someone who would sit with us, listen to our fears, and help us make decisions based on both financial logic and human compassion. The tea service arrived, wheeled in by a white-gloved attendant who moved with practiced silence. As Mr. Pemberton poured, I found myself thinking about the conversation I'd had with Margaret just hours earlier. She'd been so certain that emotional considerations were obstacles to optimal performance, liabilities to be minimized rather than assets to be leveraged. Tell me about Harrison IV, I said gently, accepting the delicate china cup he offered. His expression softened, the careful composure giving way to grandfatherly concern. He's 22, just graduated from Princeton with a degree in environmental science. Brilliant boy, passionate about conservation work. He was planning to spend the next few years working with wildlife preservation organizations before the symptoms appeared. I set down my teacup and pulled out my leather notebook, the same one that had drawn mockery from my younger colleagues. What kind of treatment timeline are the doctors projecting? The condition is called Stargardt disease, a progressive genetic disorder that affects central vision. There's no cure yet, but there are experimental treatments being developed in Switzerland and Japan. The early intervention programs show promise, but they're expensive and not covered by traditional insurance. As he spoke, I was already calculating the financial implications. Experimental medical treatments often require not just the direct costs of care, but related expenses like travel, housing, and the opportunity cost of lost income. This wasn't a simple portfolio adjustment. It was a complete life restructuring that would affect multiple generations. Beyond the immediate treatment costs, we need to consider Harrison IV's long-term financial independence, I said, making notes as we talked. If the vision loss progresses, he'll need adaptive technology, modified living arrangements, and possibly career retraining. But we also can't sacrifice the family's overall financial stability. Mr. Pemberton nodded approvingly. Exactly the kind of comprehensive thinking we need. Not just solving today's problem, but anticipating tomorrow's challenges. I spent the next hour asking detailed questions about the family's goals, risk tolerance, and emotional priorities. It was the kind of deep, personal conversation that Margaret's automated system would never be able to conduct. We discussed Harrison I's personality, his parents' financial situation, the family's philanthropic commitments, and even the psychological impact of wealth on medical decision-making. There's something else you should know, Mr. Pemberton said as our conversation began to wind down. The family board includes Harrison IV himself. Despite his diagnosis, he insists on being part of any decisions that affect his trust fund. He's flying in from Boston tonight specifically to meet with potential investment advisors. This added another layer of complexity that no algorithm could account for. Managing family wealth wasn't just about optimizing returns. It was about preserving dignity, respecting autonomy, and maintaining relationships across generations with different values and priorities. I'd be honored to meet with him, I said, closing my notebook. When would be convenient? Tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock, at our family office on Fifth Avenue. But Rebecca, I need to ask, are you prepared to take on this responsibility as an independent advisor? Because after what you've told me about Meridian's new direction, I'm not confident they can provide the kind of service we require. The question hung in the air like a challenge, and an opportunity rolled into one. Hours ago, I'd been a terminated employee with an uncertain future. Now I was being offered the chance to manage one of the most prestigious family portfolios in the country. I've been thinking about going independent for some time, I said carefully. This morning's events have certainly accelerated that timeline. Mr. Pemberton smiled and reached into his jacket pocket, producing an elegant business card with his personal contact information. Then I suggest you spend tonight preparing a comprehensive proposal for restructuring our portfolio to accommodate Harrison IV's medical needs while maintaining our long-term growth objectives. If you can demonstrate the kind of personalized, thoughtful approach this situation demands, the Pemberton Group will be your first client. I accepted the card with hands that were steadier than I felt. What about Meridian's presentation next week? Oh, we'll still attend their presentation, he said with a mischievous glint in his eyes. Professional courtesy demands it. But between you and me, automated systems have never successfully managed family crises. Computers can calculate risk-adjusted returns, but they can't hold a young man's hand while he faces the possibility of losing his sight. As I walked back through the club's ornate lobby, past oil paintings of long-dead industrialists and mahogany tables where modern titans still conducted business over cigars and brandy, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Excitement about the future rather than anxiety about the past. The irony wasn't lost on me. Meridian had fired me for being old-fashioned, for relying on personal relationships and handwritten notes in an age of digital efficiency. But here, in a club that had resisted modernization for nearly 2 centuries, those same qualities were exactly what the most sophisticated client in our industry was seeking. That evening, I worked at my kitchen table until well past midnight, surrounded by financial documents, medical research, and legal papers. I researched experimental treatments for Stargardt disease, analyzed the performance of various asset classes during medical crises, and developed multiple portfolio scenarios that could accommodate different treatment outcomes. But more importantly, I thought about Harrison IV as a person, not just a beneficiary. What would it mean for a young environmentalist to face vision loss? How could we structure his finances to support not just his medical needs but his sense of purpose and independence? These were questions that required human insight, emotional intelligence, and the kind of deep personal understanding that took years to develop. By the time I finally closed my laptop, I had created something that no automated system could replicate: a comprehensive financial plan that treated the Pemberton family not as a collection of assets to be optimized, but as real people facing an extraordinary challenge together. The next morning, I arrived at the Pemberton family office 15 minutes early, dressed in my most conservative navy suit and carrying a leather portfolio containing my handwritten proposal. The building was a converted 19th-century mansion that spoke of old money and older values, with marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and walls lined with portraits of previous generations. Harrison I was waiting in the conference room with his grandfather, and the family resemblance was unmistakable. He had the same intelligent blue eyes, the same firm handshake, and the same quiet confidence that seemed to run in their bloodline. But there was something else in his expression, a vulnerability that came from facing an uncertain future, mixed with determination to maintain control over his own destiny. "Miss Mitchell," he said, his voice steady despite the circumstances, "Grandfather tells me you have some ideas about how to handle our situation." I opened my portfolio and spread the documents across the polished conference table. I've developed several scenarios based on different treatment outcomes and timeline assumptions. But before we discuss the financial details, I want to understand your personal priorities. For the next 2 hours, we talked about everything except money. I learned about his passion for marine conservation, his plans to work with endangered coral reef systems, his fears about losing his independence, and his determination not to become a burden on his family. We discussed adaptive technologies that could help him continue his environmental work, educational programs that could prepare him for a modified career path, and the psychological support systems he would need throughout the treatment process. Harrison III watched this conversation with growing approval, occasionally nodding as I asked questions that demonstrated genuine interest in his grandson's well-being, rather than just his financial situation. This was relationship building in its purest form, the kind of deep personal connection that would inform every investment decision for years to come. When we finally turned to the financial proposal, I walked them through each scenario with detailed explanations of my reasoning. I had structured the portfolio to provide immediate liquidity for treatment costs, while maintaining long-term growth potential. More importantly, I had created provisions for Harrison I's continued involvement in investment decisions, preserving his autonomy even as we planned for potential disability. "This is remarkable work," Harrison III said, studying the charts and projections I had prepared. "You've anticipated challenges we hadn't even considered." Harrison I was equally impressed, but his questions revealed the sharp analytical mind that had earned him honors at Princeton. "What happens if the experimental treatments fail completely? How do we restructure if I need full-time care?" Quote, I had anticipated this question and prepared accordingly. We've built in multiple contingency plans, each triggered by specific medical milestones. The portfolio remains flexible enough to adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining core stability for the broader family. As our meeting concluded, Harrison III stood and extended his hand with a formal gravity that spoke of centuries of family tradition. "Rebecca, the Pemberton Group would be honored to retain your services as our primary investment advisor. The terms we discussed yesterday are acceptable, and we'll execute the transfer documents this afternoon." I shook his hand, feeling the weight of responsibility and opportunity in equal measure. "Thank you for your trust. I won't let you down." As I gathered my materials, Harrison IV approached with a quiet intensity that reminded me why I had chosen this profession in the first place. "Ms. Mitchell, I want you to know that this isn't just about the money for me. You're the first advisor who's talked to me like I'm still a person worth investing in, not just a problem to be managed." His words hit me harder than any performance bonus or partnership offer ever could. This was why I did this work. Not for the algorithms or the efficiency metrics, but for moments like this, when financial planning became an act of hope, dignity, and human connection. Walking back to my car, I couldn't help but smile at the morning's events. In less than 24 hours, I had gone from terminated employee to independent advisor, managing one of the most prestigious family portfolios in the country. The old-fashioned methods that had gotten me fired were exactly what had won me the opportunity of a lifetime. But the real test was still coming. Next week, Meridian Capital would make their presentation to the Pemberton Group, armed with their new automated systems and efficiency-focused approach. They would discover that their most important prospective client had already made his choice, and that the advisor they had dismissed as hopelessly out of touch was now their biggest competitor. The revolution Margaret had promised was about to meet the tradition that had built American wealth for generations. And I was betting that when it came to managing human lives and family legacies, personal relationships would always triumph over automated algorithms. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.